tuning in. In this presentation, I will talk about how voters' perception of an economic condition may dynamically shape citizens' vote choice over time. So, voters' electoral behaviors can vary in part based on perceived national economic condition. The conventional explanation for this relationship is very simple. If the economy has been doing very well in the past, the incumbent party must be governing very well, and therefore it should be allowed to keep doing its job. If not, the incumbent party is probably not doing a good job, and therefore an alternative party should be considered. Empirically, there's a wealth of evidence from different lines of work that support this argument. For example, as early as almost a century ago, tidbits show that during the time of economic expansion, incumbent parties tend to receive a higher proportion of the vote, but the pattern reversed during economic contraction. This conclusion was subsequently confirmed by many other researchers using a variety of measures for economic conditions, such as trade activity, farm value, income, business activity, and consumer prices. More recently, studies have investigated the question on the individual level. For example, Fiorina showed that voters who believe that economic conditions in the recent past were good also tend to vote for the incumbent party. Findings of this sort are not limited to the United States context either. Similar patterns of the economic voting have been observed in various European and Latin American countries. To be sure, the relationship between perceptions of a national economic condition and the vote preference is not uniform across all individuals and all circumstances. For instance, the effects of the condition of the economy are stronger for working-class voters, for those who are less politically sophisticated, and when it is clear that the government is responsible for the economic conditions. Moreover, the influence of the perceived national economic condition is subject to various biases. For example, voters may overweight their appraisal of the short-term economy relative to the long-term economic condition. Appraisals of the national economy can also be influenced by the state of the local economy as well as the global economy. In short, many past studies have shown that economic conditions predict the electoral preferences and the voting behaviors. However, the study of the economic voting has been mainly dominated by a macro-level approach, and the individual level studies have relied mainly on the cross-sectional analysis, even in the data that are longitudinal in nature and allow for over-time analysis. Therefore, the extant studies have not explored the potential dynamic effects of the economic appraisals. In other words, it is still unknown whether perceived economic conditions are associated with changes in political preferences over time. In the present study, we extend the existing work on retrospective economic voting by demonstrating that voters who believe that national economic conditions have become worse are not only more likely to oppose incumbents at a single time point, but also more and more likely to oppose the incumbent party over time. Though they have not received attention in the literature on economic voting, there are several theoretical reasons to expect that the dynamic effects of economic appraisals exist. As past psychological research shows, the effects of a motivating factor can become stronger over time, particularly if it carries a negative valence. For example, a conscientious test taker may get increasingly motivated to study harder and later at night as an exam gets closer. Similarly, as an election gets closer, people may be increasingly motivated to vote based on their evaluation of the economic condition. Research on the impact of electoral campaigns suggests a similar logic. In general, campaigns make it easier for voters to adopt electoral preferences that better reflect their most important motives and predispositions. Campaigns can bring citizens' vote preferences into alignment with these fundamentals via learning and activation. With respect to the former, campaigns can provide voters with a larger volume of politically relevant information than at other times, which may help reinforce prior inclinations. With respect to the latter, the campaign leading to a vote also activates fundamental motives by making them more salient and presenting citizens with the information that they need to make the decisions about who to vote for. Similarly, we hypothesize that voters who believe that economic conditions have gotten worse in the past year may become increasingly motivated to vote out the incumbent over the course of a campaign to avoid experiencing further negative political consequences of perceived economic mismanagement. As the campaign progresses, perceived economic conditions may be more salient both in campaign discourse and in the minds of voters. And voters are also more likely to receive information that reinforce initial perceptions about the state of the economy. As a result, national economic appraisals may not only influence vote choice contemporaneously, but they may also motivate people to change their mind about their votes over time. That is, negative national economic appraisal at a given time point should not only predict their preferences for alternatives to the incumbent party at the same time as the past studies suggest, but should also be able to predict shifts in preferences away from the incumbent party over time. Study 1 uses data collected across 10 election cycles. It presents initial evidence that retrospective national economic appraisals not only statically predict the voters' contemporaneous vote choice, but also dynamically predict the vote choice over time. It relies on national representative data from American National Election Study time series. Each cross-section in this series consists of two waves of data collected from the same group of respondents, one shortly before each presidential election and one shortly after that. In the current study, data from 10 ANES conducted from 1980 to 2016 corresponding to each presidential election since 1980 were used. In these data, participants' retrospective economic appraisal were measured at time 1, or wave 1. Their vote preference was measured at both wave 1 and wave 2. The wave 1 preference question asks which party's presidential candidate respondents intend to vote for, whereas the wave 2 question asks which party's presidential candidate they actually voted for. To test the hypothesis, a variable called vote preference change was also created, such as a score of 0 was given to respondents whose wave 1 preference was the same as their wave 2 vote preference, and a score of 1 was given to people who changed their preference across the two waves. In order to confirm the finding from past studies that retrospective economic appraisals indeed predict vote preference statically, two logistic regressions were estimated. In these models, retrospective economic appraisals were used to predict the vote choice at time 1 and time 2, controlling for various covariates. The term for retrospective economic appraisal is significant in both models, and therefore the results confirm past findings about the static relationship between retrospective economic appraisal and the vote preference. To test the hypothesis that retrospective national economic appraisal predicts whether respondents change their vote choice over time, a logistic regression similar to Model 1 and Model 2 was estimated, which is Model 3 in the figure. In this model, the original dependent variable was replaced with the vote preference change variable, and other aspects are similar. The term for retrospective economic evaluation is significant, supporting the hypothesis that the retrospective national economic appraisal can motivate voters to change their vote choice over time. In particular, as represented by the blue line, voters who intend to vote for the incumbent party are motivated to change their mind and end up voting for the non-incumbent party if they believe that the economy is not doing very well. Conversely, as represented by the orange line, voters who intend to vote for the non-incumbent party are also motivated to change their mind and end up voting for the incumbent party if they believe that the economy is doing well. Two additional models were estimated to explore the effect of two time-varying variables. According to these results, whether Republican or Democrat was Whether a Republican or a Democrat was the incumbent party does not really matter in terms of motivating people to change their vote preference. However, whether a sitting president from the incumbent party was running for the president in a re-election does matter. People who originally intend to vote for non-incumbent do tend to change their mind to vote for the incumbent later on. In short, Study 1 presents evidence that retrospective national economy not only statically predicts voters' contemporaneous and future vote preference, but also dynamically predicts the vote preference over time by predicting whether voters would actually vote for the people who they originally intended to vote for. In order to replicate the findings from Study 1 and to better capture the continuous dynamic process through which retrospective national economic perceptions relate to vote preference, Study 2 uses a second longitudinal dataset that contains a measure of a vote preference at 4 different time points. The measures for the key variables are similar to Study 1. To confirm past findings, 4 logistic regressions were conducted to use retrospective national economic appraisal to predict the vote preference at all four waves, along with covariates. These results once again confirm the past findings that retrospective national economic appraisal predicts the vote preference. One may also observe that the size of the coefficients is larger in later waves, suggesting the longitudinal change pattern that was hypothesized earlier in the presentation. As shown in this figure, the proportion of the respondents preferring the incumbent party increases among those who have a more positive view of the economic condition, and vice versa for people who have a more negative view of the economic condition. In order to formally test the hypothesis, generalized logistically mixed effect regression models were estimated to predict the vote preference over time. As predicted, the results in Model 3C show that the relationship between economic appraisal and vote preference becomes stronger over time. 12 logistic regressions were conducted to provide a more complete picture of the change. Each regression uses retrospective national economic appraisal to predict whether or not a respondent would change their vote preference later. In these models, no change is coded as 0 and change is coded as 1, similar to how it is coded in Study 1. Reviewing this table in its entirety, the overall pattern is consistent with the hypothesis. Respondents who indicate that they intended to vote for incumbent party in an earlier time point tend to switch their vote choice in a later time point if their economic appraisal is negative, and vice versa for respondents whose appraisals are more positive. Therefore, overall, the results from Study 2 is consistent with that of Study 1, confirming the hypothesis in a longitudinal dataset that has more time points. Overall, these results suggest that national economic appraisal has an overlooked dynamic effect on people's political attitude. These studies have several implications that should be noted. First, changes in citizens' vote preference is an important political outcome, but it has often been overlooked in the past studies. The current studies have revealed several variables that can change people's vote preference. Second, it suggests that models that are used to predict the vote preferences may be biased without accounting for time, and this can be especially true in the context of ongoing political campaigns. Using economic appraisal variable collected at an earlier time point to predict future political behaviors without taking into account the temporal distance between them can underestimate the impact of an appraisal variable. Finally, the current study suggests that changing voters' perception of the economic conditions by highlighting the economy may be a worthwhile endeavor that can help voters to be effectively reward and punish the parties based on their performance, given that its effect can be amplified by time. It should be noted that although most citizens do not change their vote preference over the course of a single election cycle, it is still important to understand what motivates the changes that do occur.